Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and this first at least half hour or so, we're going to talk about China. And then just as a program note, let me just mention next hour, we're going to have our good friend Lee Strobel with us, going to talk about his new book, The Case for Heaven. So if you'd like to hear some really encouraging things coming from him, certainly stay tuned, and I hope you will stay with us as we talk about some things that don't get discussed very often, because China, I believe, is an enemy of the United States. The actions of the Chinese Communist Party illustrate that they intend to be the dominant superpower in the world, and we should pay attention to that. Let me issue the obvious disclaimer. When we are talking about China, we're not saying that we're against Asian people or we don't like Chinese people. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, and it is amazing how many times people will simply say, well, that just shows you're anti-Asian, which would come to a real surprise to all the Asian Americans, for example, in my Sunday school class, including the chairman. But that is, I think, done intentionally to just dismiss, I think, a very helpful discussion that we need to take here, because so many people in the mainstream media won't say this about China. I'll give credit where credit is due, and you'll hear that in just a few minutes. And the reason we do this is there are just a number of things that have happened within the last week or so that are so significant that you need to know about that. And speaking about this last week, we, of course, within the last 2 weeks, had now the Build Back Better Act, which is actually passed now of the Budget Committee in the House of Representatives. And so one of the things that we have as an action item for you today is to go to our website, pointofview.net. We have the Build Back Better Act. That is that $3.5 trillion boondoggle, that's my word for it, that is going to do all sorts of things, in which it's going to try to increase the IRS oversight of your life. We've talked before about that $600 minimum. It spends an enormous amount of money in climate change. As a matter of fact, one of the articles we've posted here, which I think is kind of interesting, really was about the election, but it starts off, Paul Gottfried, by quoting from Stephen Miller, reminding us that if you want to try to get a handle on this $3.5 trillion budget-busting kind of proposal being put forward, it's kind of a, if you will, a really interesting marriage of Green New Deal compared and combined with critical race theory. And we'll get more into that article that's on the website right now a little bit later. I posted it more for what he says about the election, but begins by quoting a little bit about what it means in terms of that. So many of you probably know that you're a member of Congress. Probably he or she has already made up their mind about whether they're going to vote for that $3.5 trillion disaster. But I think it is still important for all of us to let our elected representatives know how we feel. And so this has made it very easy. I've had lots of people say, look, I just never wrote to my member of Congress. I never took the time to send an email. But all I have to do is go to pointofview.net, click on the Take Action, put down my zip code, so it will remind me what my representative is in case I've forgotten. And then you have a sample letter, which I can modify any way I want. And then I send it off, and at least I've done my civic duty. opportunities. So we've made that easy for you today, and it's available on the website. But let's get back to China. The reason we're talking about this, first of all, is because, as I mentioned yesterday, China, we found out, actually tested a hypersonic nuclear-capable missile. Now, this one caught a lot of people off guard. I'm going to have more to say about that in just a minute, because you have one source actually told the Financial Times, we have no idea how they did this. The reason for that is just a few days ago, we actually had a very interesting article. I think it was in one of the British news sources, if I remember right, saying that the idea of the United States developing a hypersonic missile was just too difficult and too expensive. Well, it wasn't too difficult or expensive for the Chinese, because they not only have created at least one or more, they have actually tested it. And to give you a feel, it flies very fast, and because of that, it's a little hard to control. They missed their target by quite a bit, but it flies at Mach 5. That's 5 times the speed of sound. Are you ready for that? So, again, one of the other reports said that this shows that China is far more advanced than U.S. officials realized. The test also raised real questions about why the United States often underestimates China's military modernization. And so the concern is that as one individual who is at MIT, a weapons policy and professor, said, this would allow China, which is not party to a lot of these arms limit treaties, to bypass missile defense systems, because hypersonic vehicles, in this case a hypersonic missile, fly at low trajectories, can manipulate and maneuver in flight, which makes them even more difficult to track and to destroy. So that has led to one of the articles I've posted here, and you can read it in its entirety. I'm just going to summarize it. This is by Rich Lowry. He calls it the new missile gap. Now, for some of us old-timers around the table here, and so some of you that have gray hair or no hair at all, you'll remember back in the 1950s when we had what was called the Sputnik moment. For you younger listeners, let me just point out that back then there was a wake-up call, certainly for the military and for what later came to be known as NASA, that the space race was on and Russia was ahead. And so this is sort of, in some respects, people saying it's a little bit like that when you now see that a missile that we were told that the United States probably could never really need to develop, couldn't have the technological ability to develop, wouldn't certainly want to spend the money to develop, is in the hands of the Chinese. Well, that's a wake-up call. And, of course, he says the Biden administration is hesitant to call our competition with China a new Cold War, even though Beijing, that is, of course, this head of the capital of China, has zero qualms about making the parallels with our decades-long struggle with the Soviet Union abundantly clear. And so he is arguing in this piece, just like Sputnik was sort of a wake-up call for individuals in the 1950s, hypersonic missiles could also be the wake-up call for a number of people, because he says that these missiles are both unpredictable and fast. He says 6 times faster than a Tomahawk missile, because I think it goes a little less than Mach 1. That means they're uniquely suited, he says, to defeat our missile defenses. Not only can't we counter them, but we also can't track them adequately. And then goes on to say there was one professor, another one at MIT, that said, just because China tested the capability doesn't mean it will deploy it. And I love what he says. Well, the history of expansionist totalitarian states forbearing from fielding advanced weapons after pouring significant time and resources to develop them, to say the least, is not very encouraging. I think we have to abandon all wishful thinking and admit the obvious. And let's just face that the Chinese Communist Party would love to use this missile either to attack a country or, more significantly, to simply threaten a country and begin to force countries to back down. So, as he points out, China has been allowed to rob our technology. Some evidence that this even came from the hypersonic lab there in Duke, from what some people call the Elon Musk of China. But we'll get into some of that. We need to take a mandatory break. Continue our conversation about China right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the best-selling books of the last decade have been written by the New Atheist. Although you may never meet any of these authors, you will certainly interact with skeptics who use their arguments. One of the best Christian books to help refute many of the arguments by these new atheists is the book Is God Just a Human Invention, written by Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow. They answer 18 of the most cited arguments used by the new atheists against religion and especially against Christianity. One of those arguments is found in the title of the book, that God is merely a human invention. Sigmund Freud wrote that religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. In other words, we project the existence of God based upon a human need. It is wish fulfillment. We wish there would be a God, so we assume that he exists. As McDowell and Morrow point out in their book, there are many good reasons to reject this idea. One objection is that Freud's argument begs the question. In other words, he assumes there is no God and then merely tries to find an explanation for why someone would believe in God anyway. The projection theory can cut both ways. If you argue that humans created God out of a need for security, then you could just as easily argue that atheists believe there is no God because they want to be free and unencumbered by a creator who might make moral demands on them. It's not surprising to read how many prominent atheists in the past have acknowledged just that. They wanted their sexual freedom and found that required that they reject the idea of God. Paul teaches in the book of Romans that fallen individuals suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The Bible also has a good explanation for why most people believe in God. The writer of Ecclesiastes observes that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, talking about China for a few more minutes. And, of course, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You will notice over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be quoting time and time again from our good friend Gary Bauer. I even thought maybe we should just have him on the program, but I can kind of summarize this pretty quickly, but would love to get his thoughts, because when we talk about China, he is one very good source. Gordon Chang is another. By the way, Gordon Chang this week is speaking with the IPI group, which, of course, is the one that Dr. Merrill Matthews works with. And Gordon Chang has been in studio with us. He's been by phone. So there are some people that are speaking the truth in the midst of this, but this is a wake-up call, which, by the way, is our second article. But before we get to that, let me quote from Gary Bauer, reminding us, of course, that you have this hypersonic nuclear-capable missile being fired. And he reminds us that, according to one expert, we have no idea how communist China did this. Others say they were astounded and stunned that Beijing was far more advanced than we realized. And I love Gary Bauer said, really, I'm shocked that our intelligence agencies keep getting shocked, because think about this, and he asks a very good question. What do our intelligence agencies get paid for? I know they recently, he says, arrested a leftist couple in Maryland on espionage charges, but they were surprised by the collapse of Afghanistan. They were shocked by the thousands of Haitians showing up at our southern border. Maybe says they're too busy looking for right-wing extremists in the military. Did they take their intelligence agencies away from investigating communist China to spy on the local soccer league or school board meetings? Something is apparently distracting. And then, of course, he asks the obvious question, has anybody in the intelligence community ever been fired? And I'll leave that for you to figure out, because I want to move on to the second article that we're talking about today. And this, interestingly enough, comes from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which has the provocative title, China's Hypersonic Wake-Up Call, in which, again, they talk about the missile, but then they add to this another element I want to put on the table, and that is, they say in the third paragraph, the hypersonic news follows the discovery this year of hundreds of new missile silos in the Chinese desert, almost certainly for nuclear missiles. And then they make the comment, which I think is intuitive, this isn't the behavior of a nation merely interested in defending its sovereignty. China has global ambitions. And that brings me to the October issue of Outlook. Those of you that are donors, I suggested you might want to get that probably more likely has landed in the mail some time ago, and pull out your top October issue because it deals with the issue of China. It has a section that I've written about simply on the origin of the virus. By the way, that came from China. A whole section on China's global ambitions in terms of some of the very key events and the desire for China to be the most powerful country in the world. A section on could America lose a war with China, and then why Taiwan matters. Then we have a very good piece by Ivy Nichols, which I'll get to in just a few minutes, on countering China's long game. Maybe we shouldn't have so much of our supply chain over there in China, you think? And then a good piece as well by Liberty McCarter on human rights and Hong Kong. So this is something that we have sent to those of you that are donors. If you're listening right now and say, well, I'm not a donor, but I'd kind of like to see that, can you just send us an email? We'll send you a copy, because I think it would be just a great opportunity for you to read some things you won't find elsewhere. But let's just begin to count all the reasons why China is in the news, at least for us, and why maybe it's being ignored by the mainstream media. And that is the origin of the virus. Still having trouble kind of figuring out where it came from. The idea of a hypersonic missile, and now, of course, hundreds and hundreds of missile silos that look like this to be the case. And our editors there at the Wall Street Journal went on to say a couple of other things. First of all, it is important to understand that the next major war won't look anything like the last one. They said the U.S. homeland was spared from most of the World War II's destruction, but the next conflict will certainly feature cyber attacks. I do want to come back to that maybe later in this week. Hypersonic missiles, and even unmanned vehicles using artificial intelligence to put the U.S. at risk from afar. Hiding behind Fortress America won't be possible if it ever was. And then they remind us of the same question that Gary Bauer asked. The intelligence community, say, is made up of some 18 different organizations or agencies that receive $85 billion, and Congress should investigate what we're paying for and what we're getting. So some really good points that are made there as well. And again, if you go to this very good article in Outlook, it really tries to cover all of the issues. For example, you have all of these flights and incursions right now into Taiwan. It does seem that China is trying to, if they can, probe and figure out how Taiwan might respond to an incursion. I predict that indeed it is quite possible that Taiwan might actually fall, that China will go into Taiwan, and the only reason they aren't right now is, don't forget that the 2022 Winter Games are going to be held in China. So my prediction is that maybe they won't be doing any kind of really aggressive action till after those, because the goal in part is that the president or the dictator, whatever phrase you want to use, President Xi Jinping, wants to use these 2022 Olympics to herald kind of a new China-led world order. Just as Adolf Hitler used the 1936 Olympic Games to show off the First Reich, or the Third Reich, I should say, Third Reich. And it would be a mistake, he thinks, that this might actually be the case. And we'll get back into some of the ways in which the government is receiving some kind of sponsorship. But just before we take a break, military is certainly important in terms of military hardware. but also military is dependent upon the soldiers, the sailors, and others that you can actually deploy. And this is one other place where when we had a conversation with Gary Bauer the other day, he mentioned it, but let me just again go to a very important piece that appeared in his Tuesday, September 21st end of day report, in which he points out that this article that he's quoting from in the Wall Street Journal says that Chinese President Xi Jinping is committed to returning his country back to Mao's communist roots. And Mao Zedong, of course, was the leader there, and then goes on to say that the China youth are burning with their patriotic fervor for Mao and for China. Now, we were having a conversation off the air that when you have sort of a gun pointed at you, when you have a social credit score, and where your success in China depends on supporting the regime, that, of course, leads to people being very supportive of what is happening in China and the Chinese leadership. But again, recognize these individuals don't have the opportunity to read the kinds of news and information that you and I have a chance to read. And you can begin to do the comparison that Gary talked about. On the one hand, you have these patriotic youth that are ready to fight and die for their country. On the other hand, what do we have in America right now with the military? Oh, well, we have some of our educational elites that have been demonizing our founders. Just pulled down a statue of Thomas Jefferson just the other day as evil men. And so on one hand, you have demoralized individuals that maybe don't believe in this country fighting against those with incredible patriotic fervor. And it, I think, illustrates, again, something that we need to pay attention to. But just before we take a break, let me mention that one of the things we've posted for you today is an action item, and it is very simple. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. Middle column there says Take Action, and it's the Build Back Better Act. Now, if you click on that, you will see that we give you some possible ideas of why you would be concerned about that, starting with $3.5 trillion. Unless you think that's a problem, one of the articles I've posted today by Stephen Moore, Taxing America First. That is certainly the issue. Also, one of the other articles I've posted on, again, the election, but the first point of that makes a case for all the kind of toxic ideas that are in that particular piece of legislation. So again, you can then hit the button that says Take Action. Then we give you a couple more ideas. You put in your zip code, and as soon as you put in your zip code, then it will take you to a sample letter. We give you the opportunity to edit it any way you would like. And then just, of course, if you've already done this before, it already has your name, address, and everything, you hit submit. If this is the very first time you've ever done it, well, then you can just fill that out and hit the button submit, and it's sent automatically. I've had lots of people say, I've always meant to contact my member of Congress, but just, I'm busy. Well, this won't take you 2 minutes. And I would encourage you to take the time to go to pointofview.net, click on that button that says Take Action, and follow it through. And since we're going to a break, you won't miss any of the context or any of the conversation that we're having. And so if you would like, you can also give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, take some phone calls right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Before we start taking phone calls, let me just mention this segment. I do want to talk a little bit about this article by Ivy Nichols in our Outlook on countering China's long game. In particular, also want to quote from a couple of people, Senator Tom Cotton, as well as Gary Bauer, once again, on some of the people that have been, and some of the organizations and even parts of the government that have been enablers of the Chinese Communist government. And so we'll talk talk about that in just a minute, but let's take a phone call or two. We'll head to Missouri, first of all, KTTK. Tom, thank you for joining us today.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to mention the fact that I don't see why anybody is surprised about China launching a supersonic vehicle that can establish orbit, because they've been putting a lot of their own stuff into orbit for a while now. And the scary thing is Mach 5. Well, that's the speed that's required to obtain and maintain an orbit.
Yep.
And the fact is that we can do the same thing in probably a matter of weeks, if not months, just by stacking warheads on top of Elon Musk's vehicles. Except ours, we can recover the launch vehicles.
When you were talking about this, I was just thinking, wouldn't it be good if we had a president that created something like a United States Space Force? Oh, wait a minute. That's what President Donald Trump did. And I think it illustrates again that maybe the next frontier, space is not just the next frontier, it may be the next frontier for any kind of military action. So, Tom, thank you for reminding us of that. And if you'd like to join the conversation, I'll give a few more of you a chance in just a minute. But let's get to this whole issue, because in our Outlook magazine, Ivy Nichols talks about the fact that we have an economy that is really too dependent on China. We are depending on them, for example, for tech items, for various essential ingredients in medicine. Didn't we find that out recently? And, of course, so if you add to that the possibility that China could take over Taiwan. Now, that gets you back over to my particular article there. 24 million people in a island about the size of Maryland. First of all, the benefits of that for us to be able to have, instead of just floating cruise carriers and things of that nature, but actually have a port. But more than that, how dependent we are on some of the various electronics that come out of Taiwan. And so that's why there have been many people saying maybe it is time, especially as we're facing these supply chain challenges, to disconnect from China. And at the very time you would think that would be what we want to do, I'm now quoting from a piece written by Senator Tom Cotton, in which he refers to the Secretary of Commerce as really the Secretary of the China lobby. But again, let me quote from Senator Cotton for just a minute. He says, China's most loyal and lucrative partner is not a foreign government or a national leader. It's a group of multinational businesses, Hollywood elites, ivory tower intellectuals, weak-kneed diplomats, and entrenched bureaucrats located here in the United States. And, of course, you could add to that, as much as I love the NBA, the inability to even talk about China in a critical way, even when you have the human rights abuses, which, by the way, Liberty McCarter writes about in also the Outlook article in October. But anyway, Senator Tom Cotton says, now we have a China lobby, and its new leader is Joe Biden's Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. She is arguing an argument that I will revisit again when Penna Dexter is with me on Friday, because the argument we used to hear, and this is back when Marlon Maddox was the host and Penna Dexter and I were the co-host, the argument being made, and we disagreed with it at the time, is we have to let China become part of the World Trade Organization, and we need to actually bring China into the modern world. And the way we do that is to have more investment in China. So as a result, as it becomes more capitalistic, more free enterprise, it would become more of a republic. Well, it does have kind of a capitalist society, if you will, pretty much moderated by the Chinese Communist government. But we've been doing this now for decades. Unfortunately, the Secretary of Commerce doesn't seem to understand that. And so, if nothing else, he points out that she has now been announcing plans to bring American executives to China and further entangle our economies. And so it brings us back to some of these companies, and we may do an action item in the future in this regard, because if I might now, for just a minute, quote again from our good friend Gary Bauer. He says, virtually every day there's a new piece of information from the military advances Communist China is making, or the latest Chinese spy that was arrested. And it was interesting, the most recent spy arrested was in Maryland, but most of us that grew up in California know where a lot of that's in Silicon Valley, but I digress. But he goes on to say that China is threatening all of our allies, promising death to America. He's got a link to that. And then points out that while that's all happening, American capitalists, he mentions BlackRock and Bridgewater and some of the others, along with American corporations like Apple and Disney, are pouring billions of dollars into communist China, a nation that obviously is intent on becoming the dominant superpower in this 21st century. And he then points out the irony of that. These same corporate CEOs don't hesitate to punish U.S. states that demand fair and transparent elections. I'm talking about you, Georgia, Texas. They'll do business with communist China, a slave labor nation that is neither fair nor transparent about anything. And he says, and these corporate executives can't do business in states that want to protect babies with a heartbeat bill, thinking about Texas there, or preserve privacy in restrooms, think about North Carolina. I mean, he goes through this long list and just reminds us that, again, many of those corporations are investing. And so we may have an action item, because one thought is, should the United States even participate in the Chinese games, the Olympic Games? But more importantly, should we at least allow some of the corporations right now, or should we maybe shame some of these corporations that are actually putting their corporate profits ahead of human rights abuses? And he gives us a short list here of Airbnb, Coca-Cola, Intel, Procter & Gamble, Visa, and a couple of the others. So many people sometimes wonder, well, what can we do? Well, maybe we can express our opinion to our elected officials. And on this issue today, we're focusing primarily on the Build Back Better Act, but we may do one on China in the future. So that is one thing that we might want to do, but also we might want to express our opinion to some of those corporations that are pouring all sorts of money into communist China. But let's take another phone call. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In South Carolina on the Good News Network, Chad, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call. I was just going to bring up the fact that we now have a president sitting in the Oval Office that's going to sit there and talk about how basically there's no hope for democracy anymore, that the future is going to be an autocracy. And he's talking about this after having conversations with Vladimir Putin and President Xi. And it's just amazing to me that it feels like I'm living in a twilight zone, that I'm actually hearing this coming out of the mouth of the President of the United States.
Does amaze me. And again, if you seriously think that he's going to be very critical of China, recognize the connection just economically between Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and China. And of course, also the fact that for so many of these corporations, there is money to be made with China. And so it's going to be sometimes very difficult for people to speak out against China. I can't even imagine the kind of emails and criticism I'm going to get over the next few days, because we've talked about China, because this is a topic we're supposed to just sort of ignore. But the future of our country, the future of your children and grandchildren, I think, depend on that. So, Chad, I appreciate you calling in today.
Yes, sir. The love of money is the root of all evil.
There you go. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I do want to get into a couple of the other articles I've posted, and many of them kind of fit very well with our action item today. One by Stephen Moore, Taxing America First. And I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just simply to show that actually when you reduce the tax rate, it actually increases the revenues. And so we'll talk about that. Also, Paul Gottfried's piece on dealing honestly with the election, because I do want to mention real quickly that it has some really good things to say about the election, and the book by Molly Hemingway, who, by the way, I think we'll probably have on the program in the future here, Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and Democrats Seized Our Elections. But even the first part, before he gets to Molly Hemingway, reminds us of some of the toxic things in this $3.5 trillion their boondoggle. And if you have not taken the time to contact your 2 members of Congress, well, actually, today we'll just encourage you to contact the House. So it's only 1 email. It's available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We've got more things to talk about. Don't forget, we've got Lee Strobel with us next hour as we talk about the case for heaven. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention a couple of the articles we've posted on the website for you to read. And then next hour, we're going to be talking with our good friend Lee Strobel, the case for heaven. Of course, you're familiar with him, the case for Christ, the case for faith, case for the Creator, case for grace. So we'll be talking with him, and I'm looking forward to that opportunity. One of the other articles I've posted here is a piece by Paul Gottfried. And again, he is an individual that has been very concerned about the last election. He's the editor of Chronicles. He has oftentimes expressed the fact that there have been some really significant problems with the way the 2020 election was done, and has oftentimes been criticized by other conservatives because maybe they think he's gone too far. But I posted it for two reasons. Number one, the first page, almost 2 pages, really is a reminder of some of the other kind of philosophically toxic ideas that are in this $3.5 trillion spending package. As Stephen Miller, for example, was part of the Trump administration, said that the bill is basically the Green New Deal combined with critical race theory, combined with massive amnesty, open borders, combined with a complete destruction of the American economy. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, but I think it was a good way of illustrating the fact that if you're looking for a Pandora's box of really bad ideas, it's there. And if you need to know some more information, of course, our action item today is to actually address that issue. Just scroll down a little bit to the middle section there, Build Back Better Act, and you can contact your member of Congress about this issue. But then he goes on to spend some time talking about first Molly Hemingway's book, Rigged, How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. I've heard we're going to try to get her on in the future, so you can have a chance to hear from her. But even when I was out of town last week, there were others pointing out some of the other research kind of coming down now in terms of how, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, of course, with Facebook, distributed $519 million to various Democratic state governments to outsource the election management, the harvesting of absentee ballots, some of the other aspects that are in that particular book, but also some new material that's come out as well. And so for some of you that have always had questions about the 2020 election, I'm not saying I agree with everything that Paul Gottfried has put in here. I wanted you to have a chance to hear that. This is, again, a service we provide, even if I may say, I wouldn't have said it that way, or wouldn't have agreed with that. I want to give you that chance to read it for yourself in ways that those kinds of ideas simply will not be even considered, much less publicized or given a fair hearing in the so-called establishment media. But another one I want to get to real quickly is by Stephen Moore. He's been on the program with us many times before, and he calls it Taxing America First, because this one, of course, reminds us of what would happen when we increase taxes, and you've got to increase taxes to even come close to coming to the ability to pay for a $3.5 trillion additional expense. So he also points out that when actually he and Larry Kudlow went to then candidate Donald Trump, proposing that we reduce the corporate income tax, the business tax rate, from the highest in the world. By the way, if you go back to Build Back Better Act, it would now raise that up even higher than the corporate tax of China, but you can read that for yourself. And he said that we argued at the time that it would really benefit those American workers because it would give them more jobs and higher wages. Of course, all the liberal economists at the time rejected that because the argument always is, if you lower the tax rate, you're going to lower the taxes. No, if you lower the tax rate, you almost always increase the tax revenues. And of course, that's just what happened as well. By the end of 2019, right before the pandemic, of course, the United States had one of the most prosperous economies ever. And those who benefited the most by percentage were those in the bottom of the economic ladder and those who were minorities. And he says, I remember visiting Trump on the Oval Office and telling him that the tax cuts had worked better than any of us had predicted. And this is vintage Donald Trump. Donald Trump sat back, said in his usual grandiose fashion, not more than I predicted. Well, okay, gotta love that. But anyway, he goes on to point out that if you look at this, the Congressional Budget Office just reported that federal corporate income tax receipts were up 75% this year to a record $370 billion, and the total federal revenue was over $4 trillion. You'd think that government could actually live within $4 trillion every year, don't you think? And you'd be wrong. No, that's not even coming close. And also pointed out that, and he goes into a paragraph here talking about some of the richest people, the Mark Zuckerbergs, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. He puts LeBron James in there just as a shot, I guess. And they all paid more as well. And it basically, as he concludes, says it's a policy that lifted all boats. And that was the Trump tax cut. So again, the policies actually worked, and now, of course, we have the tax policies threatening to reverse that. So if you've always wanted kind of some of the facts and figures and numbers, maybe you have a debate about whether or not these tax cuts were a good idea, because now you have people saying, well, look at all the people unemployed. Well, that's because of the pandemic. If you look at the month before we actually started closing down the economy, we were blowing and going. My, how people tend to forget. But again, this gives you some of the facts and figures which I think are really relevant right now when we're talking about whether or not we want to increase taxes and even increase more government spending. As we come to the end, Charlie Cook, who we quote from so often, talks about Joe Biden in Wonderland and quotes from Alice in Wonderland. Alice said, "If I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is because everything would be what it isn't. And contrary-wise, what it is wouldn't be, and what it wouldn't be, it would." You see? And he's saying, in a sense, the interesting reality that we have right now is the job report is lackluster. The border is a mess. Gas prices are sky high. Supply chains are broken. Inflation was supposed to be transitory, looks persistent. Americans are still stranded in Afghanistan. China is testing space nukes. We just talked about that a minute ago. COVID is still with us. And despite having a good, jolly, catchy name, the Build Back Better agenda, all the public seems to know about the president's gargantuan spending plan is it will cost trillions upon trillions of dollars. And so then he goes through how the administration tries to put a positive face on this. For example, in Kabul, Afghanistan, well, that was the largest airlift in history. What about all the people at the border? Well, that's due to climate change, but we're going to fix that. What about the hypersonic nuclear weapons? Well, again, we're just going to be in stiff competition with the other nations. What about inflation? Well, it's not going to happen, the president says. But even if it does, his chief of staff said, well, that's just a high-class problem, you know. But that's nothing to be worried about. And besides, Secretary Buttigieg, he's going to take care of all of that. And then when you start looking at even the cost of a $3.5 trillion boondoggle, well, the president assures you that it will cost you nothing. And so it's a fascinating little piece. We didn't post it today, but Charles Cook is, as we've said before, kind of a national treasure and reminds us of the fact that people are just simply being told, don't believe your eyes, don't believe your experiences, just believe what we have to say. And I just don't think that's going to work very well, especially for those of you that listen to Point of View. Well, let's take a break. First of all, you're going to find lots of articles that you would want to use if you wanted to make the case to your friends, neighbors, and coworkers. You might want to post some of them on Twitter or Facebook. You'll also find my Viewpoints commentary today on how to maybe answer some of the atheistic arguments, which we talk about. But most importantly, let me point you to the Take Action, Build Back Better Act. If you have not contacted your member of the House of Representatives, we've made it very easy. You can do this during the break. And when we get back together in just a few minutes, we'll have Lee Strobel with us. We'll talk about The Case for Heaven. It is a fascinating book. I'm hoping it will be a fascinating discussion. And that's the kind of stuff we like to talk about here on Point of View. So again, you can find all of the things we're talking about today on our website at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with our good friend Lee Strobel right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As we've been promoting for a couple of days, we are excited about the fact that now we're going to be talking with our good friend Lee Strobel about his new book, The Case for Heaven, A Journalist Investigates Evidence for Life After Death, published by Zondervan. No doubt you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we do have information about that on our website, as well as information about him. You are certainly familiar with him, New York Times best-selling author, 14 million copies of his books. Also the founding director of the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics at Colorado Christian University, an individual that was educated at the University of Missouri, also Yale Law School, of course, 14 years with the Chicago Tribune, and probably best known for so many of his books, The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for the Creator, Case for Grace, but this one I think is going to be really an encouragement to all of you, The Case for Heaven, and we are just privileged, as always, Lee Strobel, to have you on the program.
Well, thank you, my friend. It's great to be on your program. Love you and your listeners.
Well, it's a start off with your own situation, which I didn't know anything about. There was a time in which you were a little bit closer to death. We're going to be talking about near-death encounters, and you had sort of somewhat of one. And that also, along with the fact that after you became a Christian in, I think it was 1981, you began to kind of do an investigation, which led, of course, to this famous book, The Case for Christ, as well as, of course, some of the things that you're now investigating in The Case for Heaven.
Right. It was several years ago when I came close to dying. My wife found me unconscious on the bedroom floor. She called the paramedics. I woke up in the emergency room, and the doctor looking down at me, and he said, "You're one step away from a coma, 2 steps away from dying." And then I fell unconscious again. So I was close to death. I was kind of hovering over that kind of fuzzy border between life and death for quite a while. Until the doctors were able to save me. I had an unusual medical condition called hyponatremia, which is a severe drop in my blood sodium level. And I lost a kidney as part of it. And as I say, I was close to death. And I found it was a very clarifying experience. As distasteful as it was clarifying, because you find that at that moment, when you don't know if you're going to make it out of that hospital, only one thing becomes super, super important, and that's what happens when you close your eyes for the last time in this world. Do you fall into oblivion? Are you snuffed out like the light in a refrigerator when you close the door? Or is there an afterlife? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Or reincarnated, for that matter? And, of course, I was a Christian at the time, so I believe what the Bible teaches about an afterlife, but as you know, Kerby, I tend to be a skeptic. My background's in journalism and law, and when you're in that situation, you begin to question things a bit. I remember for this book, I interviewed Luis Palau, the famous evangelist, who died recently, went to be with the Lord. He knew he was dying, which is why I interviewed him. And he said, in these moments when you know you're going to die, Satan kind of whispers in your ear, "Oh, sure, Luis, you shared your faith with 1 billion people, but you're not going to heaven. You're not, So these, your mind gets kind of mixed up at times like this, and you're kind of searching around for solid ground. And so anyway, that's what launched me on what eventually became this book, The Case for Heaven, which, coincidentally comes out at a time during the pandemic where so many people are talking about this. I mean, 29% of Americans either know someone who's died of COVID or they have had a family member die of COVID. I lost my brother, my older brother, at the beginning of the pandemic. And so people are concerned. I remember a few weeks ago, my wife and I were at a restaurant, and our waitress is about, 18 years old. And she started to cry as we talked to her, and we said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Oh, I almost didn't come into work today. We just lost a family member to COVID." And I thought, here's a young woman, about 18 years old, probably never thought about death before. I mean, my goodness, she got her whole life ahead of her. But now death has come knocking on her family's door. Now she clearly had anxiety and apprehension and concern about it. So I think this is coming at a time when there's a real need for it, nationally and even globally.
Let me just mention that the book is about 300 pages. It has 10 chapters. We'll try to cover some of those in the hour that we have on this particular topic. We have a discussion guide at the end. We also, of course, have a link to leestrobel.com. You can find all of that at our website, pointofview.net. But one of the big issues that surface almost immediately is in your chapter on searching for the soul. Are we conscious beyond the grave? And so we've heard so much about these so-called near-death encounters. I've written about this, and Dinesh D'Souza's been on the program talking about this. So what did you find? Because you got a chance to talk to some of these neuroscientists and others about this issue.
Yes, I was a skeptic, Kerby, about this. I thought, oh, come on, these are hallucinations. These are the last gasps of a dying brain. This is oxygen deprivation causing these things. That's what I thought. And then I found there have been almost 900 scholarly articles written in scientific and medical journals on near-death experiences over the last 40 years. This is a very thoroughly researched area. And actually The Lancet, which of course is the very prestigious British medical journal, carried an article said that none of the common alternatives that people propose to near-death experiences hold up under scrutiny. They can't explain all the dimensions of what takes place. So I went into it as a skeptic and determined not to buy into anything that I couldn't corroborate. So I thought, you know what, I'm only going to accept that which I can corroborate. And what I found is a lot of cases where we have strong corroboration that indeed at the time of clinical death, a person's consciousness, their soul, their spirit, does separate from their physical body. And in many cases, people observe the resuscitation efforts taking place, and they see things and they hear things that they otherwise could not see or hear. Like the story that's reported by a researcher named Kimberly Clark Sharp about a heart attack victim named Maria. It's kind of probably the most famous case where Maria was flatlined. She's clinically dead. And her spirit drifts out of her body, and she watches the resuscitation efforts, and then her spirit floats out of the hospital. And then when her spirit returns to her body and she's revived, she says, "Oh, by the way, on the hospital roof, on the third-story ledge, there's a man's tennis shoe, and it's left-footed, it's dark blue with a wear mark over the little toe, and a shoelace is tucked under the heel." And they go up and investigate, and sure enough, they find it exactly as she has described it. That's the kind of corroboration. I say, okay, something is going on there. Especially when you look at one of the most amazing studies I found, where researchers examined 21 blind people, half of them blind since birth. And most of them said they could actually see during their near-death experience. And they were able to describe things they would not have been able otherwise to have seen. So, and then when they return to their body, their blindness returns.
Sure.
As you know, so there's so many cases where we do have corroboration. One researcher studied 93 patients who made verifiable observations while out of their physical bodies during a near-death experience.
Incredible.
And 92% were completely, totally accurate. Another 6% were almost accurate.
Let's take a break. We will continue our conversation with our good friend Lee Strobel, The Case for Heaven, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Many of the best-selling books of the last decade have been written by the new atheist. Although you may never meet any of these authors, you will certainly interact with skeptics who use their arguments. One of the best Christian books to help refute many of the arguments by these new atheists is the book Is God Just a Human Invention, written by Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow. They answer 18 of the most cited arguments used by the new atheists against religion and especially against Christianity. One of those arguments is found in the title of the book, that God is merely a human invention. Sigmund Freud wrote that religious beliefs are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. In other words, we project the existence of God based upon a human need. It is wish fulfillment. We wish there would be a God, so we assume that he exists. As McDowell and Morrow point out in their book, there are many good reasons to reject this idea. One objection is that Freud's argument begs the question. In other words, he assumes there is no God and then merely tries to find an explanation for why someone would believe in God anyway. The projection theory can cut both ways. If you argue that humans created God out of a need for security, then you could just as easily argue that atheists believe there is no God because they want to be free and unencumbered by a creator who might make moral demands on them. It's not surprising to read how many prominent atheists in the past have acknowledged just that. They wanted their sexual freedom and found that required that they reject the idea of God. Paul teaches in the book of Romans that fallen individuals suppress the truth in unrighteousness. The Bible also has a good explanation for why most people believe in God. The writer of Ecclesiastes observes that God has set eternity in the hearts of men. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about the book The Case for Heaven with Lee Strobel. And I'm holding up a book that I wrote back actually during the 1970s. It was published by Zondervan in 1980, Life, Death, and Beyond. Because what was happening there is the same kind of things. You had Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and then Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life. And you were having these near-death encounters. And we were trying at the time to even give some answers to the fact that there certainly seemed to be some things that could be explained physiologically or psychologically or pharmacologically, but others obviously were something that could not be explained by natural phenomenon. But sometimes people were having positive experiences. And Lee, in the third chapter of your book, you even talk about this idea of Raymond Moody and Life After Life. Since then, you've had Kenneth Ring and a variety of others. And as you said, a whole incredible study of near-death encounters. But what was kind of troubling at the time was most of those people came back reporting positive experiences, even if they weren't believers. Now, I think 40-some years ago, I gave some answers to it, but I think you have some even better answers now in your book.
Well, you know, it's very interesting. I think one of the most amazing things that I encountered in my investigation is, for my book, I interviewed John Burke, who is a Christian pastor of a terrific church in Austin, Texas, and has studied 1,000 near-death experiences over the last 35 years. And he concluded that if we look at what actually occurs, and not how people interpret it, but what actually occurs, near-death experiences are consistent with Christian theology. He said to me, Lee, even though they vary a fair amount, these accounts have a common core, and incredibly, it's entirely consistent with what we're told about the afterlife in the Bible. And so some of these things, like you mentioned, bothered me as well. It's like, well, so many people come back with a positive experience, although about 23% have a hellish experience,
yes,
which absolutely transforms them. But we have to remember that these people are not permanently dead. They're not irretrievably dead. They're going to come back. They're clinically dead. And that's an important distinction because it means that some of the teachings we have about what happens when a person dies may not apply to people who are merely clinically dead and who are going to indeed come back from the dead.
And again, you look at the book of Hebrews, it's appointed man to die once, and after that comes a judgment. Well, these people didn't go through the judgment. Of course, we're going to get into your chapter on reincarnation, which I've written about as well, because there's just so much misinformation out there.
Yes.
But in some respects, your book can be a real encouragement to people recognizing that there is life after death and there is a heaven. But at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily base our theology on a resuscitation after 3 minutes. We're basing it on a resurrection after 3 days, right?
Exactly. I mean, I specifically make the point that I don't base my theology on these near-death experiences. I take a minimalist approach, which is to say, what can I have confidence in based on what's corroborated? And based on that, I can say with strong confidence that at the moment of clinical death, our spirit, our soul, our consciousness does continue to live on. How long? We can't tell from the data from these near-death experiences, but that is affirming of what the Bible says, because, as the Apostle Paul said, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And Jesus told the repentant criminal on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise, which means there's two aspects to the afterlife for Christians. There's the present heaven, or the intermediate state, which means that when a person dies, their soul separates from their physical body, and they go to be to paradise in the presence of God, or to Hades, separated from God. And then at the time of the consummation of history, when Jesus returns, that's when the second phase begins. That's when we receive our resurrected bodies. We go through, at that point, the final judgment, and then we spend eternity in a very physical place, whether it's heaven or hell. And so these near-death experiences, to me, are confirming of the fact that indeed our consciousness, our spirit, our soul does endure after our clinical death.
One of the other things, since you were going through that we might mention is the fact that we've had Randy Alcorn on the program. Matter of fact, I think we actually devoted 2 hours to his book on heaven because it's so big. So sometimes people get confused about the where this all fits in terms of heaven, the new heavens, the new earth, and those kinds of things. So those are some resources. And as a matter of fact, while we're at that, you have a whole discussion guide at the end, because I think this is the kind of opportunity for, you talk about an evangelistic opportunity. When you're talking about heaven and hell and life after death, I mean, you don't have to try to get to the gospel. You're there already, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. I mean, you talk about something that's relevant. This is relevant to every human being on planet Earth. We also have, and this was just released this week, we also have a 5-week video-driven small group study called The Case for Heaven and Hell, that even goes further than the resource guide in the book, and can take a small group on an experience where I do about 20 minutes of teaching every session by video, and then there's discussion and interaction and so forth. So you're right. This is a very relevant topic, and especially these days. It was interesting. I was speaking just this last weekend at a church in Fort Worth, Texas, and I asked the congregation there, I said, 29% of Americans know someone or have had a family member die of COVID. How about you? How many would say that you have? My goodness, I think 85% of the hands went up.
Amazing.
It is, and so this is something that's in the face of a lot of people. They're wrestling with this and saying, if my brother, for instance, my brother was an atheist who died. What happened to him? What is going to happen to him? These are issues that become very relevant to every human being.
Let me just mention again, we have a link to Lee Strobel. So first of all, of course, you can find the case for heaven. Scroll down a little bit, you'll see the case for miracles. We've talked about that before. But when you hit the button that says learn more, that will then take you to, for example, a great little video that's on YouTube, and you can then post it on your Facebook page or maybe some Twitter post, or maybe even send it by email to someone. That would start a conversation. Then there's other resources that are available. So I just want you to know that those certainly exist. And just before we get into some other aspects of this, early on you talk about this whole parade of near-death encounters, and you quote from our good friends J.P. Moreland and Gary Habermas.
Yes.
And they give all sorts of examples, but I thought it was interesting because I'd heard this story before, but I couldn't document it until I found it in your book, because I'd heard this before of a woman thought it was on her deathbed, and she actually heard somebody saying, well, I think she's going to kick the bucket. Well, she heard all that and went back and told him. She's told doctors things that they said during operations. And there's a lesson for us to learn, those of us that are pastors. Even when you think somebody has died, they still might be able to hear you. Even when you think they're in a coma, they still might. So, recognize as we learn when we do radio, the microphone is always on. In this case, somebody may actually be able to hear some of these comments, even though you think that they're only being spoken to the people of the living, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, there's some amazing stories about people clinically dead, and yet when they come back, they're able to describe the patterns on the ties that the doctors wore and the jokes that the doctors told to kind of relieve tension. One woman who had every drop of blood drained from her head as part of this highly unusual surgery she had. 3 tests confirmed that her brain ceased to function, her heart and breathing stopped. She was flatlined. She was clinically dead. And yet, she described later how she watched the operation from outside her body. She described going through a tunnel, talking to deceased relatives, standing awestruck in the very light of God, being sent back to her body to wake up. And the corroboration is she was able to correctly describe the highly unusual surgical instruments that were used, things that she had no physical way to see. She described conversations that took place during her surgery. And get this, she was able to tell them, oh, by the way, why were you playing the song Hotel California during the surgery?
I just love this stuff.
Admit, kind of a strange thing to be playing, but they were.
I think so. Anyway, let's take a break. We're having a good time here, but when we come back, we've been talking about some of the physiological and neurophysiological issues, but we do want to give you a little bit more on the theological issues as well, because, what about heaven? What about hell? What about this idea of reincarnation on the edge of eternity, some of these deathbed circumstances, and so much more. So again, this book goes into all sorts of different interviews that you can actually hear from different people that are actually being interviewed, as of course Lee Strobel is so able to do. It is published by Zondervan. If you certainly can't find a copy in your local bookstore, and I can't imagine that, or maybe you aren't near a bookstore, then we do have a link that you can follow that will take you to it, both in hardback and Kindle. Of course, we have a link to leestrobel.com and all sorts of resources at our website, pointofview.net. Have a lot more to cover on the case for heaven, and we will cover all of that with Lee Strobel right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Lee Strobel as we talk about his book, The Case for Heaven. But just before we do that, Lee, I thought we would really talk for a second, if we could, about the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. You are the founding director and the executive editor, of individual I think very highly of as well, Mark Middleberg. And this is a way in which individuals can study some of these issues, whether it's miracles or whether it's the case for heaven or the issue of evangelism and apologetics. And you really have a vision to place these individuals in churches all over the country, don't you?
We really do. We gathered together 40 PhDs and created 91 totally online courses that are accredited on the bachelor's degree. You get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in apologetics and evangelism. Or you can just take courses online for your own edification. Things like small group evangelism, how to do small group evangelism, or on the resurrection, or on Islam, or whatever. But we really believe that one of the missing ingredients in churches in America and beyond reaching people for Christ is that churches don't have anyone dedicated to evangelism in the church. They don't have evangelistic leaders under the direction of the senior pastor. So we're trying to train people, whether they're going to be volunteers or work full-time or part-time in churches, to be the evangelistic point leader in that church, to kind of lead the charge on evangelism. Because we believe the pastor can't do it all. He needs someone who can lead that initiative within the church. And then apologetics, of course, is part of that. And training the entire congregation, 100% of them, in how to share their faith naturally and effectively. So we're passionate about the local church and about its potential to reach people, but, we aren't doing so well right now. It takes 87 church members working 1 year to lead one person to faith.
I know.
I mean, that's a formula for the demise of the church. So we got to do something, and we want to place these leaders in local churches around the country.
One of the things we did at Pro Ministries is had a survey just this last year, about 3,000 individuals, primarily younger. So we're talking about Generation Y, Millennials, Generation Z, and we found the same thing. It was no different than the Lifeway surveys or all the other ones. This one probably worse, because we found that very few shared their faith, and even more concerning, some of the ones who shared their faith actually didn't have a biblical worldview. So that didn't work so well.
Great.
So again, we have a lot of work to do. And I thought for just a minute, you have a chapter here on the pyramid to heaven, truth, worldviews, theism, revelation, resurrection, and the gospel. It's a good way to actually deal with these issues, and especially since you have such a heart for evangelism and apologetics. Can you share that before we move on to some of the other topics?
Yeah. Absolutely. It was funny. Many, many years ago, I was a pastor at a church, and I just gave a sermon on the evidence for the resurrection. And an atheist came up to me and said, "That was really interesting. I'd like to learn more. Could I make an appointment to talk to you?" And I said, "You know what? I'm sorry. I'm leaving town for 2 weeks, but my friend here would like to talk to you." And it was a volunteer apologist in our church named Chad Meister.
Oh, yes. I know him.
Yeah. You did. Chad later went on to get his PhD at Marquette and become a well-known Christian philosopher. So he met with this man, and in preparation for that, he came up with this pyramid idea, which is to say, let's begin at the broadest issue, which is what is truth? And then let's look at different worldviews, theism, atheism, pantheism. Then let's look at why theism makes the most sense by applying tests of logic and livability. And then let's look at revelation. Why does the Bible stand up to scrutiny and other religious texts don't? Then let's look at the resurrection, the evidence that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God and backed it up by returning from the dead. And then the ultimate pinnacle of the pyramid is the gospel itself. And so he drew that and talked through this with this man, this atheist, all evening. And then at the end of the evening, the man came to faith in Christ. And so I interviewed Chad for the book, and we walked through this pyramid. And you're right. I think it's a really good way to kind of start in a very broad way, what is truth, and build in a very logical manner the case for Christianity and ultimately the case for heaven.
One of the things I love about all of your books is you do these interviews. You have, of course, interviews as well with Scott McKnight and Paul Copan and a variety of others. Chad Meister, we just mentioned a minute ago. And so these are opportunities. You mentioned John Burke earlier. So as you go through here, it's not just a lot of writing. It's sometimes back and forth, some stories that you're telling and those kinds of things that are going to be really helpful to individuals. But you do have a whole section, since we are talking about the case for heaven, called Heaven a Guide. McKnight, and certainly some of that comes from Scott McKnight and others, because it's important for people that they probably have the wrong view. They think that, well, heaven's going to be floating around on a cloud, and they don't understand the concept of how it unfolds in the book of Revelation. Can you give us some guide there?
Yeah, you're right. A lot of people think it's a very ethereal existence. You know, we're up in the cloud someplace. It's a very spiritual place. We're kind of ghostly souls on a cloud or whatever. When actually heaven is not, as Scott McKnight points out in my book, heaven's not some far-off place. It's actually here. It's the complete renewal of our world. It's a very earthy and physical place, not just for spirits and souls, but for resurrected bodies designed for the kingdom of God. God says in Revelation, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away." And so as McKnight told me, he said, "Lee, heaven will resemble our present earth, but it will be a transformed place for transformed people. All of creation will be set free to turn to praise and to God in praise. It will be creation on steroids, the way things were designed to be. Be a place of celebration and music and songs and festivals and festivities." And then he said with a wink, "And every year, the Chicago Cubs will win the World Series."
I sort of thought maybe that was coming. Just before we go on,
which I love, because when I was a child, a toddler, I was actually kissed on the cheek by the most famous Cub of all, Ernie Banks, who was a rookie that year.
Ernie Banks.
Yeah, so I got to love the Cubs.
Well, we love baseball around here as well. And again, the Cubs were always overdue. And then one day they finally did. Yeah. You got a whole section here on questions about heaven, and we won't maybe get into all, but this is another reason to buy the book. Will there be pets in heaven? Will there be marriage in heaven? I think most people know the answer to that one. Will there be rewards in heaven? Hopefully most Christians know that one. Also questions about, what about whether or not people should be cremated? What about children who die? I just got that one at a Bible school last week. Who will be in heaven and all the rest. So those are the parts about heaven. But I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about hell, because you have a whole section about logic of hell and escape from hell. And this surprises people. Jesus really spent more time talking about hell than he did about heaven, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And this is something I felt I had to address, the logic of damnation. The logic of hell, why it makes sense. Because there's a lot of teaching these days by, unfortunately, some of the younger pastors who are embracing either annihilationism, which means that the unrepentant will not spend eternity in hell, but they will be snuffed out of existence, perhaps after a short period of punishment. But they'll be snuffed out of existence forever. Or they're teaching universalism, which is that everybody's going to heaven. And these are, I call them escapes from heaven, but they just don't stand up to scrutiny. I think annihilationism comes closest. Even John Stott, who's sort of the evangelical pope of the 20th century, came to embrace annihilationism before his death. And so I think it's a secondary issue. And I think you can make a pretty good case for it biblically, but I don't think you can make a compelling case. I think it falls short in the end. And because you have verses like Daniel 12, verse 2, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and others to everlasting shame and everlasting contempt. So you have a parallelism. If heaven is everlasting, then hell is everlasting. And then Jesus, of course, teaching about the sheep and the goats when he says the unrighteous will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. There's a parallelism that has to be respected there. So I wanted to deal with this, and I wanted to show the one thing that as hell bothers me, it bothers a lot of people. I thought it was one size fits all, that everyone would have the same experience in hell. But as I point out in the book, and I cite Matthew and Luke both in this case, there's good reason to believe that one size does not fit all, that people will experience hell in a way commensurate with the life that they live. So Adolf Hitler is going to have a different experience in hell than my next door neighbor, who's an atheist, who hates the idea of God, and for him, being in God's presence would be hell, but he's going to have a different experience in hell than Adolf Hitler will. I think that's important to understand from the perspective of seeing God's fairness. And there's misunderstandings. People who think hell is torture. It's not torture. It's something applied from without. in other words, apply to someone. There is torment, which is an internal state of anguish, certainly, but not, it is not a torture chamber that God, and does God really send people to hell? We really send ourselves to hell in the sense that we reject the evidence of God's existence, and we suppress that, and we walk away from that, and we reject the free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for us on the cross when he died as our substitute to pay for our sins. And so, in a sense, we're sending ourselves to hell.
Let's take a break. We have a few more things to talk about with Lee Strobel. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with our good friend Lee Strobel, The Case for Heaven. It is published by Zondervan, about 300 pages. And just want to pick up maybe two other points. One on the issue of reincarnation. You do such a great interview with a good friend of ours, Dr. Doug Groteis. He used to be on Probe staff with us. He's on the program with us quite often, and we've talked about, certainly New Age books that he has written about. And, of course, you interviewed him in The Case for Miracles. He was good because, number one, he really answers the questions about reincarnation in a very effective way, but then also, as we've talked about before, lost his wife, Becky, and, of course, looks forward to seeing her in the future. But this whole idea of a reincarnation sensation, I think it very quickly sets aside things like the story of Bridie Murphy, the teachings of Shirley MacLaine, and that's important because some people get a false hope by believing that, if I don't get it right this time, I'll just come back and there's a cyclical life, isn't there?
Yeah, there's so many misconceptions about reincarnation. I mean, people think, well, the goal ultimately is heaven. Well, it's not. In Eastern religions, the goal is enlightenment or nirvana. And nirvana is described as what's left when you blow out a candle. It's the extinguishing of yourself. And so there's no heaven where we spend eternity in the presence of God in a blissful, wonderful state. You're extinguished, which is a whole different matter. In fact, reincarnation, when you think about it, is the exact antithesis of Christianity. Christianity is the only world religion that is not based on working our way to God, but it's based on salvation being a free gift of God's grace. And reincarnation says, hey, look, not only do you have to work your way to God, but you are so bad, you're going to have to do it over 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 lifetimes, and you still might not make it. So it's the opposite of grace. It's the most works-based system you can have. Besides which, if you believe in reincarnation and you're suffering in this world because of the karma that you brought in from a past life, you have no idea what you did in that past life. What are you paying for? What are you trying? How are you trying to improve? It's just the most unfair thing you can possibly imagine. It also discourages people from charity because if someone is suffering, they're working off the karma. They need to do that. So don't intervene. Don't make their life easier. You might as well let them suffer so that they can pay off their karma. There's just so many logical problems with reincarnation that Dr. Grotheis points out so well, and you pointed out in your writings as well.
Well, again, it's something we're going to have to start addressing again because I'm seeing some other films coming out with that theme. But in the interest of time, let me move on because one of the last chapters is On the Edge of Eternity, such a poignant interview with our good friend Luis Palau. And also just maybe a reminder of the fact that in some cases, people will be tempted to want to hand this book to somebody who is terminal, somebody who is struggling with the whole issue of life. And I think you and Luis Palau do a very good job of helping us kind of get a heavenly perspective while still here on earth.
You know, it was a powerful time. I spent a day with Luis. He knew he was dying. It was his last interview before he died. And it was so profound, and we covered so many interesting areas. But I'll tell you, Kerby, the thing that he said to me that I'll never forget, he said, Lee, I can tell you from personal experience that at the end of your life, when all is said and done, you will never regret being courageous for Christ.
Yes.
And that was powerful for me. I mean, that is so true. And here's a guy who shared Jesus with 1 billion people during his life. And so he talked about what he would say if he could send a text message back from heaven to all the Christians on planet Earth. What would he say? And he said, I think I'd say, go for it. Seize opportunities to share this good news with other people. It's the Holy Spirit's job to convict them of their sin. He's your partner. You just bring them the good news. Tell them the gospel. And I said, what would you say to non-believers if you could send a message back from heaven? He said, I think I'd say, don't be stupid. and he laughed. He was so winsome. He didn't mean it with a mean bone in his body.
No.
He was just saying, do the smart thing.
That's right.
Come to faith in Christ and
So
know
good.
that you'll spend eternity with him.
It's kind of interesting because the two words that just keep surfacing again and again here this year on Point of View, one is discernment, the other is courage. And the first couple of chapters are all about discernment. And then now we've talked at the end about courage. But in the interest of time, you've got a section on Scripture Speaks, some of my favorite verses dealing with heaven. It's just outstanding. But then a fairly lengthy discussion guide. So it is very obvious to me that you have provided this as ready to go. This is plug and play.
Yes.
And if you want to have a ongoing evangelistic Bible study or look at this book and have a discussion each week in your church, in your small group, in your home, you've got it ready to go, don't you?
It's ready to go, and I think people are more willing and more anxious, more excited about talking about this stuff than we think they are. And by the way, Kerby, this is kind of a newsflash, but coming in March in movie theaters will be the movie The Case for Heaven. It's being filmed right now in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's a documentary. It'll be 3 days in movie theaters, 3 nights in movie theaters in March, and then it'll go to streaming. So those who maybe prefer to watch a movie than read a book, that'll be an opportunity for them to engage with FIFA and bring non-believers to the theater to see it, to lead to spiritual discussions.
Well, again, I know that you're a busy man, but I hope we could get you on to promote that, because we do like to promote family-friendly films and faith-affirming films. This one would be one of the best of all, so I hope we can make that happen. But just before we run out of time, let's talk about what people can find when they go to leestrobel.com, because not only do you have the information about this book, but one I also commend to people. You might want to buy a twofer, Case for Heaven and The Case for Miracles, because the two are almost like bookends. And then there's an opportunity for people to contact you, get you involved in speaking and a variety of other things. And, of course, we've already talked a little bit about the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. So give us one more opportunity to talk about some of the resources that you are making available.
Yeah, I for me as a legacy, I'm going to turn 70 years old in a few weeks, and my legacy, I believe, is going to be this center that we've created. And, I know a lot of your listeners are people who are really interested in apologetics, and you have provided them with such great resources through the years. And I'm hoping some of them will say, you know what, I want to go deeper. I want to study this more, and I want to do it online, but maybe get a master's degree or maybe just study for my own edification. We need in this time, in the 21st century, as my friend J. Warner Wallace says, evangelism is spelled apologetics.
So again, you are certainly at the forefront of all of that, and I just can't commend this book to individuals enough. As I said, 300 pages, published by Zondervan. It's been out, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. If you need any other links, they're all available at pointofview.net. And Lee Strobel, what a great friendship we've had with you over the years, and thank you once again for joining us here on Point of View.
Well, you are awesome, Kerby. You are the best at what you do, and I appreciate. As we text and say, I appreciate you.
Well, that's a good way to end. Lee Strobel, on to a very busy day, no doubt. And again, I want to thank our friends at McClure Munson to set that up. And of course, we've certainly appreciated Lee Strobel. And remember, even before he wrote The Case for Christ, we did an interview one time on this program, and so we've known each other for a long time. Matter of fact, that goes back 3 radio studios since then. So this has been just a good relationship, a good friendship, and a reason for you to find out a little bit more. The Case for Heaven, a journalist investigates evidence for faith after death, really trying to answer lots of different questions, 10 chapters, and also a discussion guide, what happens after we die, Scripture Speaks, and a variety of other resources. So take the time to find out about it, and you can find out about it right at our own website, pointofview.net. That's all we got for today. Certainly a great interview and a great individual. Want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer and Steve for his help as a producer. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.